Good morning, everyone. This is Saturday morning, and welcome to our Bible study. It's February 1st, 2020, and we are recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America. And we welcome you all. And our moderator today is Luann.
I will start by reading the quote from Science and Health. We should become more familiar with good than evil and guard against false beliefs as watchfully as we bar our doors against the approach of thieves and murderers. We should love our enemies and help them on the basis of the golden rule, but avoid casting pearls before those who trample them underfoot, thereby robbing both themselves and others.
Thank you.
I thought this was important an important quote for this lesson because oftentimes, we read throughout the lesson that Jesus went out into the cities and villages and taught, and there was a lot of opposition from the Pharisees and that, but he never swayed. He always went out and reached out to the people that he needed to teach these lessons to.
Yeah, and Mrs. Eddy explains here what divine love is. It is loving all because you can't help but love. But while you're doing that, you do it with wisdom. You don't cast your pearls before swine. And what's that all about?
Swine would know the value of the pearl. So.
Yeah, you don't preach to those who are, who start out totally opposed. You preach to those who have an interest and are ready to receive some kind of instruction. Otherwise, you just keep preaching them.
Yeah.
In the lesson this week, it talks about how Jesus sent his disciples to preach and heal, but said, "Do not go into the Samaritans." Or I don't have my lesson in front of me, but so he was very specific as to where not to go, but it was for their own protection, so that they wouldn't get discouraged. And I sometimes wondered about that. If you're supposed to go everywhere, why would he say? But it was really because he knew what they were able to do and didn't want to be discouraged. They wanted them to be successful. And to me, that was showing compassion towards all.
Well, he also knew that those who were most receptive to this truth would be those Jews who had at least had the instruction of the Ten Commandments and instruction in the one God, and not being brought up thinking that there were other gods, and therefore would be confused and wouldn't be ready for the better explanation of who this one God really is.
Yeah, he instructs them to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Not to everybody in Israel, but to the lost sheep.
They are the ones, as we have been talking about, that need it, who have that humble heart, the meek, and there's a readiness to receive this truth. Otherwise, you will get unnecessary resentment and kickback.
One of the things that I've learned from experience and had a lot of help here in this church is that when we have this treasure of truth, it is absolutely impossible to have a neutral position about it. And from my experience, either I've met people that love it and embrace it, or they go the other way. They actively dislike it or hate it. One or the other. There's no neutral position here. So hence the enormous need for wisdom.
Something that, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Something that came to mind as I was listening to this was that sometimes the lost children of Israel might be referring to people who didn't agree with the Pharisees and were questioning them, and they didn't like what they were hearing, and so they went away from it. And Jesus was bringing them back what was true.
Yeah, thank you. And that's true. That's, some people who have been lost in the organization and question and don't understand what's going on there, they're the ones that are receptive. While those who think it's fine and are still part of it, well, that's fine. You can do whatever you feel inspired to do. But our church, we have to remain with purity. And that's why something that came up recently, you're free to read whatever you want to read, to have whoever practitioner you want to have, but you don't bring it into our services, our other things that we do here, because we are maintaining a strict purity of our independent science and what's going on here. And we can't afford to have it diluted with organization or New Age or other things. This isn't personal; it's principle, and we have to do it, because otherwise it erodes and it will eventually collapse. It has to be the purity.
I think I like the stress on the pure science. We're not talking about people so holy or something, in case it's misconstrued as such.
No, absolutely not. The laws and precepts that we abide by. And so we are an independent church. Yes, people are free to do. They can come. You can come to our website. You can read. You can do a lot of things. But we're not putting it out. We're not putting it forth, because it's offensive to us, to those of us who have been maintaining the purity. If you have been mixing it, it's not offensive to you, and that's fine. But to us, it's offensive, and so it can't be allowed.
There's a sense of sacred trust. Mary Baker Eddy had this absolutely pure divine revelation. You can't be mixing it with things of the world or ways of thinking in the world. So there's a sacred trust here.
Yes, thank you.
If you're mixing things, then you can't really be where the good comes from and where the not good comes from. That's why scientists, when they're making an experiment, they always control the conditions. So it's better just to come here and be all in and then judge it on its own merits.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and Mrs. Eddy says something here that I think is really important for us as Christian Scientists to understand. When she says, avoid casting pearls before those who trample them underfoot, thereby robbing both themselves and others. When you try to preach to someone who is not ready, she says you're robbing them and you're robbing others. Think about it. This is why this human do-goody is so damaging. When you go around thinking that you've got something that everybody should have, You're going to give it to them whether they want it or not. You're harming them.
And you're robbing them because if they're not ready for it, then
it just hardens their resistance to it.
Yes, thank you. That's right. It hardens their resistance to it. So that's how. So then maybe when they are ready, they will be already turned off to it. So timing is very important. And perhaps that gets us to a question about preaching and teaching.
Yeah, we can move to question 1. Is preaching and teaching the same thing? Define each.
Hey,
go ahead.
What's the definition of preaching?
Proclaiming, publishing in discourse, inculcating. So.
Yeah, it's usually a religious subject, to deliver a powerful message, to declare something with conviction. But another definition, and this is not in the 1828, but it's, what is that? The giving of moral advice in a pompous and self-righteous way. That's why you have to be careful, because no one likes to be, as the expression goes, preached to, right?
It's the quickest way to turn somebody off.
It is, and that's robbing them. It's robbing them.
I mean, like standing in their face and looking your finger at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, not preaching to, but preaching at.
Yes. Anyone else on preaching? Otherwise, what is teaching?
I think the preaching part also, it has that already sense of, oh, you don't know, or you are less than me. I'm giving you something you need, don't you know? And that's offensive, as you've been saying.
Thank you very much. That is one of the things I read a long time ago, some article about why people are atheists. And one is that they just could not stand this attitude. People would be telling them about God and other things that other person was superior to them, and they were talking down to them, and that is a huge turnoff. You talk to another child of God. You don't talk down and think you know something that they don't, because they might know a lot more than you. So it's very damaging, and there's no love or compassion in that.
And that's why not all preachers are that good at it.
Well, that's true.
I think that preaching coincides with demonstration. You can preach more effectively through demonstration.
And that's example.
But Jesus did implore us to preach the gospel to the poor. So what's he telling us to do when he says preach the gospel to the poor?
Those who are receptive for it.
Get the word out. Don't be bashful.
But also by your example, I think he's saying.
Well, that's just it. People can tell mentally where you're at, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you tell people about what you've learned of God, how God has helped you, when it rings true, it brings something very positive to them. But if you're talking about something that you haven't lived, you're talking about something theoretical. It's like what's that phrase in New Testament.
Yeah, tinkling
Tinkling
cymbal.
Brass and a tinkling cymbal or something. Sounds hollow.
And it's grating. And I have seen people so turned off to any kind of religion because of this, what we're speaking about. But yeah, we are told to do it, but if we do it from our heart and with love, heart reaches heart. Love is reflected in love. You can reach the person. But if you do it out of a sense of superiority or because you're so great, and then you will turn people off. And that is a sin.
There were two quotes that Mrs. Eddy I found, and she says, "In meekness and might, Jesus was found preaching the gospel to the poor. And the error of the ages is preaching without practice."
Thank you. That's perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. The error of the ages.
So we preach in meekness. And what's that?
And might, yeah.
And
Humility.
Humility.
You know, it's not me doing it. It's not me preaching. It's the word of God. It doesn't come from a person.
Yes.
And that is where the might comes from.
Then you can speak with authority because it's coming through you from God. And what was the era of the ages?
Preaching without practice.
Preaching without practice.
Without the demonstration of it.
So, thank you very much, Karen. All right, what about teaching?
Well, the definition I have is to instruct, to inform, to communicate to another the knowledge of that which he was before ignorant, leading someone to something that before they didn't know. So being a former teacher, that's, but again, the best teaching is by example.
Jeffrey?
I confused teaching and preaching a lot with the children. And it always ends up sounding like preaching to them or lecturing. I tried not to do it the way that turned them off, but it always came out wrong. And then one day I tried what you said, tell them what you've learned about good, about God, your own personal experience, sharing your own strength, your own hope, and how it's helped you. They sort of lean into that, and they listen, because you're talking about something you've lived, something that's happened to you. But the other way around seems to be you're not talking so much about you. You're pointing a finger at them, and you want to fix them, talking down to them. They can be 4 or 5 years old, and they know exactly where you're coming from.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That's wonderful. They do. And also they're living with you. Or what is your example? Do as I say, not as I do. Like parents will sometimes say, if you're not living it, then
forget it.
But, yeah. And that was Mrs. Evans in talking to her as a practitioner. She was always speaking from her own experience. She wasn't shy about that. She would tell life examples and things that she's been through, and that's what she taught us to do as well. Because that's not preaching. That's practice, and that's the difference. And this is something very important you all should know. In Eustace, the bottom page numbering 3:4, and it goes with this idea of teaching. It's something on education. And Eustace says, education is not teaching something to ignorance. It is bringing to light the intelligence that is omnipresent. It is the sun unfolding the flower in loveliness and beauty. It is the constant joy of anticipation. Inferiority complex is the lie that God, as the one infinite mind or intelligence, is not infinite. Could this be? Is there a single spot where there is less than all intelligence? Ignorance can never be enlightened. The ignorance that says that 2 times 2 makes 5 always remains the same ignorance. Enlightenment, otherwise called education, leaves ignorance to itself and goes forward with what is, thus swallowing up what is not. The teacher imbued with this understanding of education reaches the end of his teaching year rested, not wearied by his work. So always remember, in speaking to anyone, you're not speaking to ignorance. You're speaking to intelligence, the child of God, and you are bringing out what they already know. That's why I often say, remember this, remember that, because I'm just reminding people of what they already know. It's innate in them. And that way you reach them, because it's the truth of being, whatever it is you're trying to teach or preach.
It has a beautiful sense of loving, sharing. Yeah.
Well, and it is also the only correct way to see someone who would be considered a student in a teaching situation as a equal child of God, capable of knowing everything that they need to know when they need to know it. And yes, it's not talking down to ignorance or filling up a cup that isn't full. It is bringing out, as Mary said, what is innately already there, just bringing it to light. And students can tell when the teaching is right. They'll say, aha, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that feels right. Because it was already true within themselves to begin with.
I like what you said, Florence, about loving. If you love, you're going to melt whatever resistance. Because, if people hear something said or if they see something done, but if they feel the love with it, then they're naturally attracted to it. We sang a song in our church, let your love be a light unto the people. So it's the love that does it. Or does it say in Science and Health, divine love illuminates, designates, and leads the way. So if love is the preacher and the teacher, it's effective. But if not, forget it.
Yeah, I'd heard a story about Bruce that when, this was many years ago, but he took a little boy to the, excuse me, someone's calling, it shouldn't be. He took a little boy that was visiting him and took him to a work party. And this little boy had never been to a work party. He didn't know how to do anything, paint and so Bruce lovingly taught him these things. And so many, many years later, I happened to meet this boy who is now a man, and he never forgot that. He never forgot the love that Bruce expressed to him. Neither did the mother, because evidently no one had ever done that before or since. And the little boy learned how to, whatever project they were working on, but he also felt the love. And it wasn't, Bruce, I'm going to show you how to do this, and you stupid idiot, you're doing it wrong. But it was just whatever, giving him a paintbrush or letting him, right, Bruce?
We just worked together and had a great time.
We just worked together and had a great time. And that child remembered it all these many years. And that is what a good teacher and or preacher does. And it's the love that they remember, the love that's expressed. That's what brings about the learning process.
In miscellaneous writings in retrospection and introspection, Mrs. Eddy has several pages she takes to speak about preaching the gospel. And it was very interesting. She says here, quote, above all, trespass not intentionally upon other people's thoughts by endeavoring to influence other minds to any action not first made known to them or sought by them.
Thank you. Yeah, you're not trying to push something on somebody. That'll ruin it. It is unfoldment, always unfoldment. And the best way to do that is have that listening ear to the Father. What is the Father saying? Feed my sheep. He'll tell you what they need to know. And it said with Mrs. Eddy, when she would be with a person, she would always start speaking on something she knew that they would feel comfortable speaking about, whether that was construction or fashion or whatever it might be. And then from there, she would take it into the metaphysics, if possible. But she kind of warmed them up, so to speak. And I know that's often the best way. You don't come being zealous or bombarding with your ideas. It's gently.
Well, it was said of Jesus, he spoke to the multitude in parables because he was careful with them. He didn't mention any names. He just told a story that made a point and gave them something that they could walk away with and contemplate instead of feeling like they had the finger of accusation pointed at them. That was not there at all. So he had the wisdom as to how to instruct them. Find love working through him.
Yes.
Yeah, he didn't start out by saying, well, listen, matter is unreal.
or Mrs. Eddy's the woman in the apocalypse. You don't start out with these things. Well, God directs you. You build up to certain things.
They probably would all have left.
That's right. Okay, let's go on.
How are we doing?
Okay. I just wanted to say that many times when I read the Bible, I don't really take the time to fully comprehend the importance of every verse. So I wanted to focus on some of the verses that may not get as much time and thought as some of the other verses. So our next question, I wanted to say too that up until Jesus, the people were being taught in the synagogues by the Pharisees. Now Jesus is here traveling the countryside teaching and preaching. And I wanted to try to understand the importance of going this extra mile when then I could see how it all relates to his demonstration of God. So a lot of things came to me as I was working on this through the lesson itself, to kind of skip around in the Bible a little bit and try to understand a greater picture. So what does it mean to be the apple of his eye? That's from Deuteronomy 32:10. Let me read that.
Sure, thank you.
He found him in a desert land and in the waste, howling wilderness. He led him about. He instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye.
Thank you.
Well, a commentary says that, it also means most precious thing to one. If you're the apple of somebody's eye, it's an expression. You're most precious to that person and to God, of course. But then a commentary also said that when something is headed to your eye or gets close to your face or looks like you immediately put your hand up to protect you. So it says no sooner does something come near the eye than your hand goes up to protect it, comparing how God was ready at an instant to defend his people.
Thank you.
I found a reference. I happened to Google it, and it was saying something about to the part of the eye that reflects what one is looking at in life. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I had never thought about it that way, that the apple of your eye is what you're looking at in life. But into this meaning about protecting him, and I was thinking about the him meant man, that God is looking out after each one of us. And in the reference, it was talking about the children of Israel and taking them from Egypt, where they were treated very, very badly, and taking them from that and protecting them and showing them the way to something that was so much better.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Betty. I read somewhere that the apple of the eye is the part of the eye that lets in the light. And it's a very precious thing to be able to see the light. And think about it here in this verse. They were found in the desert and the wilderness, and yet they were led and instructed. So think of how much care God was giving, how much he was loving. But for me, it also has a reference to our church, because our church is very dear and precious. And it's part of my prayer for every activity that this goes out to open up somebody's eye so that they can see the light of divine truth. That's the apple of this eye. That's the way I look at it.
Thank you. Well, and always remember, when I read this, I just get such a sense of God's love and thinking you are the apple of his eye, how cherished you are, how loved you are, despite what your circumstances might seem to be at the moment.
And he never loses sight of you. Never.
You are the daughter or the son of the king. And your inheritance is all good. Yes, and he's ever with you. So to dwell on that, because to dwell on how much you are loved enables you to have the love of God to love and help others, as our next question leads into.
Question number 3. Discuss Jesus' compassion when he looked upon the multitude.
For me, it immediately felt, because it said let me see if I have the readings, that because they were a sheep not having a shepherd, and he was looking out from the eyes of God, not in our sense, the human sense sometimes is the human do-goody. You're looking out from the eyes of mortal. But I realized just had a greater sense of how he was looking out at them while he met their need, his grandeur, and it was all a sense of all about God, and with no human at all in it, where sometimes we're trying to be kind or do good gets mixed up in the human.
Thank you. Very important.
Exactly. Jesus was always at one with God. He didn't have an independent thought ever. outside of God. He could read people's thought for the purpose, as Mrs. Eddy says, for the purpose of healing them. He knew the need. Mrs. Eddy used to, or Mrs. Evans, I'm sorry, used to give sermons during our Sunday services after the end of the lesson. And she said she would always get up and ask God what was the need before she would open her mouth and say anything. It is the meeting of the need and knowing what the need is.
And you can only derive that from God. You can't humanly conjure up or think what it is, because that is, then the human gets into it. It just comes as a thought as to what is the right thing to do or say. And it is that compassion.
And on the one hand, yes, they were hungry, so he fed them. but he felt their spiritual hunger and their need to know more about God and God's great love for them. And that was the more important feeding.
That's what I read. And in Matthew Henry, he said the Pharisees had filled them with vain notions, burdened the people with traditions of the elders, deluded them into many mistakes, while they were not instructed, about God's real love. And then he had such compassion for them, for their souls, for their spiritual hunger. And that's the real compassion. Thank you.
And that was his mission. That's why God sent him.
And remember, when you go out in the world, this is what you are to do, to be quiet and listening to the needs of others, not to just be rushing around, smartly accomplishing much.
Accomplishing nothing.
Oh, I'm in great shape. Yeah, accomplishing nothing, not much. But to look into the eyes and the soul of people. You're at a restaurant, you're a waiter or waitress, or even a person you're passing on the street, or someone who's in front of you in a line, to have that quietness and presence of mind. And whether you speak to them or not, you can always be feeding them with the truth and having that compassion. Maybe you will be inspired just to say the right thing or do the right thing at that moment. I thought it was helpful. Thank you, Luann. The book by Helen Wright, A New Look. And speaking of Mrs. Eddy, who healed the cripple, and in speaking about it, she said, "My heart gushed with unspeakable pity and prayer." And then in a sermon by Spurgeon called The Compassion of Jesus, he speaks similarly. He says, perhaps the best, if you were to sum up the whole character of Christ in reference to ourselves, it might be gathered in this one sentence. He was moved with compassion. And then Spurgeon says, "I suppose that when our Savior looked upon certain sights, those who watched him closely perceived that his internal agitation was very great. His emotions were deep, and his face betrayed it. His eyes gushed like founts with tears. And you saw that his big heart was ready to burst with pity for sorrow upon them whose his eyes were gazing. He was moved with compassion." How much do we do that? How much do we feel that? And in this book by Helen Wright, it talks about a little prayer that Mrs. Eddy had prayed. And it's this: "O Lord, give me higher, purer, holier desires. O Lord, give me more self-abnegating desires. O Lord, give me a desire for more love. And then Spurgeon goes on, the kind of two of them. Spurgeon goes on to say, when you realize how great it is, how great the need is for compassion, are you ready to sell it, to give anything for it, to give anything for this truth? It is the pearl of great price. Are you willing to come out and to do this healing work and to pray for a heart of love and a heart of compassion? And we receive it as we reflect Him, reflect God, because it's only given by God. And Mrs. Eddy, also in that book, A New Look, she goes into different attributes that she admires. They're in Science and Health: self-denial, sincerity, Christianity, persistence, as well as patience, promptness, diligence, and perseverance. And then the beautiful and glorious traits of humanity, she said, were toil, meekness, and truthfulness, and love. And they form the stepping stones to man's divinity. We should clasp these jewels to our heart and never part with them. And then, if we don't have these qualities, we should sell everything else and purchase them, costly as they may be. Think about those traits, and think of how she and our Master demonstrated those traits, and how despite all the persecution and all the hatred that came upon them, they never failed to love. It never took the love from them. They continued the Christ until, up until being crucified, which is why He was able to be resurrected. And Mrs. Eddy too, to the very end. And I thought this was beautiful too, that with Mrs. Eddy's, order was heaven's first law. It enabled her to accomplish an amount of work such as since the beginning of time no one has been ever before achieved or executed. And then it lists them, and I hadn't thought about it like this: 432 editions of her textbook, 15 prose works writings, 88 editions of the manual, 8,000 letters filed in the archive of the Mother Church, the establishment of the journal, Sentinel, Monitor, and Quarterly, many editions of Christ and Christmas, as well as classes, and then all the healing work that she did. So as you see, no person could ever have accomplished all that. It was only letting God use her. And in letting God use her, she never lost hold of love and compassion, because that oils you so all the parts move in harmony. If you lose that and you start being hateful, resentful, or whatever, you become stiff and unable to accomplish so much good. It's such a beautiful picture. What is the difference between compassion and sympathy?
Well, I was learning that sympathy sees a problem and gets all down in it and feels like, that there may or may not be a solution, and gets their human mind all wrapped up in the problem.
Thank you.
Sees the problem as real.
Yes.
Therefore, you live with it. You deal with it.
And you feel miserable about it.
Compassion. He's the person as the child of God. The problem is unreal. And the solution in working for God.
Years ago, Mrs. Evans taught us that our mentality is either a fountain or a sink. and the sink sucks in all of the garbage into it, whereas a fountain is a free flow of fresh water. In Science and Health, it says, pour in truth through flood tides of love. So that's my take on compassion and sympathy.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah, well, if you get down in the muddle with a person, and often they're looking for sympathy, they want that sympathy. They want you to feel sorry for them. Well, then, as we were told by Mrs. Evans again, when a practitioner, had a patient come to the office quite convincing, trying to convince the practitioner he had a terrible, terrible problem. And so what did the practitioner say?
He convinced me we're both sunk.
Yes. Both sunk.
I love that.
It's true, though. I mean, the more you saying the opposite, the more what this is happening. Oh my goodness. Anyway.
Yeah, they can get very insistent on the problem, and they're only digging their hole deeper. And then they can get mad at you because you're not sympathizing with them. But you can't. As a metaphysician, you cannot, because again,
it would be dishonest. It would be bad for everybody,
and we'll both be sunk.
You will be a quack. So
yes, a quack. And then Spurgeon lists, the compassionate things that God has given us, like the Bible, like ministers, preachers, certainly like Christ Jesus, like the throne of grace, the ability to pray. It's really beautiful when you think of how much God has given us, and that he says, has there ever been an infirmity that he hasn't provided you with the answer? If you have weakness, he will provide an answer. I do not know of a single infirmity that I have or that you have, my Christian brother, but what Christ Jesus has been moved with compassion about it and has provided for it. He has not left one single weak point of which we have to say, there I shall fall because he will not help me there. But he has looked us over and over from head to foot and said, you will have an infirmity there, I will provide for it. You will have a weakness there, I will provide for it. Did you ever get into a corner where there was not a promise in the corner too? Had you ever to pass through a river, but there was a promise about his being in the river with you? Were you ever on the sick bed without a promise like this? I will make thy bed in thy sickness. In the midst of pestilence, have you not found a promise that he shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust? The Lord's great compassion has met the wants of all his servants to the end. Is that not true?
Definitely true.
It's very moving.
Yes. There's never, ever a situation where that compassion is not right there with you. And if we just would be aware of it and think about it and think about the truth, whether it's in the Bible or Science and Health, that gives you the comfort and remedies a situation. And it was also beautiful in Spurgeon. He goes through all the different things when Jesus moved with compassion. And, the leper, he was moved with compassion. Here's some horrible, dread disease, as was read Wednesday. He wasn't afraid of contagion. He moved with compassion. The love of God came over him, and we know that perfect love casteth out fear. So in that love, the leper was healed. And then there was the blind man, moved with compassion. Do any of you have eye problems? That same compassion that healed the blind man is with us here today. You know, the Christians talk about resurrection power. I always think, wow, that's amazing. That same power that resurrected Jesus after 3 days in the tomb, that's with us. Do we think about it or implement it in any way? And then he talks, the widow at the gates of Nain. Her son was being carried out, her only son. He was dead, and she was desolate. The widow's only son was to her sole stay, the succor as well as the solace of her old age. He was dead and laid upon the bier. And when Jesus saw the disconsolate mother, he was moved with compassion, and he restored her son. Oh, is there not refreshment here for you mothers that are weeping for your boys? You that have ungodly sons, unconverted daughters. The Lord Jesus sees your tears. You weep alone sometimes, and when you are sitting and enjoying the word, you think, that Absalom were renewed. Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. Jesus knows about it. He was always tender to his own mother, and he will be so to you. And you that are mourning over those that have been lately taken from you, Jesus pities you. Jesus wept. He sympathizes with your tears. He will dry them and give you consolation, for he was moved with compassion. What problem do we have, do you have, that the compassion of Christ cannot heal and wipe away your tears? So I don't know if there's anyone else on that, but it was a beautiful question and something to truly think about and embrace. Certainly not to be taken lightly. And as Mrs. Zeddy instructed, to pray for it daily if she did, and look at the healing work she did. We all can do better.
Good question. And good answers.
Okay, the last question.
Number 4. Discuss Matthew 5:38 through 47 from Sermon on the Mount. How had the people misunderstood the law of God? More so, what was their interpretation and what was Jesus' interpretation?
Okay, Jeremy?
Well, the Jews were expecting somebody to come to take care of the Romans, had vengeful, their God was vengeful, that would destroy their enemy. And Jesus' preaching was to love their enemies. Some just couldn't accept it. But others were obviously healed by it. But that's what they were expecting, to have their enemies be destroyed. And now they're being told to love them.
Thank you.
They made the same mistake that so many people have made throughout history. They personalized evil. When somebody did something wrong, they were an evil person and they had to be punished by some reciprocal evil. Jesus came along and said, no. Effectively, evil is not person, as Mrs. Eddy says, person, place, or thing. You don't correct evil with evil. He lifted them above their poor thought models, as Mrs. Eddy says.
In the parts where he is talking about giving more, like if being sued at law, take away your coat, give him the cloak also, it reminded me of that other story where he told the rich man to sell all he had. And I think having these material things that we hang on to prevents us from moving forward. And it's like too much of a temptation when people go against that for you to start to hate them, I guess. So
yeah, I mean, it goes along with the question we just discussed. We should have so much compassion. Those who commit offenses do so because they've had a tough life. There's something, that's how they've been treated. And we should have so much compassion that we rise above the mortal picture and let love heal whatever the situation is.
That's why Mrs. Eddy's article, Love Your Enemies, is so important to read and study often to keep your thought clear, because it's it's human inclination to want your enemies, so-called enemies, to be punished or destroyed or harmed in some way. And you're only hurting yourself. But that also means, we are also a terror to error, and we do not tolerate error, evil, by whatever name, but we always separate it from the person, place, or thing. Not see it as them, but as animal magnetism. And all that can do is destroy itself. And that we must know with great power and vigor. We don't let error run rampant and just proclaim God is love.
So I often think of when somebody does something really wrong to me, I think what in their life would cause them to behave this way or act this way. And I can always think back to myself, because I know how I behaved because of things that went on in my life. And I was not a very nice person at all, and the people around me were probably, wanting to smack me around because of my behavior, but they didn't. And I know that it's the great compassion I got when I first made the phone call to this church was enough to just completely get me on my way out of all of that, and then learning to love my enemy, which really now it seems like I didn't have an enemy. It was all myself. I was fighting against myself. And it just, the compassion is what really stirs me.
Thank you.
Hard to comprehend sometimes. It's like sometimes I find myself saying, why me? But then I have to realize who I am to God, and just really got me out of all that situation. It's the compassion.
Yes, you're the apple of his eye.
And if Luann can see if she doesn't have any enemies,
then we all can.
Then it's an inspiration to us all.
And Florence, tell the story that Parthens posted about in Les Miserables.
Oh, the bishop makes way for this man to live in his house, and he ends up stealing a lot from the bishop. But the line that he gives a clip on on the post is, when they come together again, the bishop, I mean, it's just an incredible level of compassion. This we're talking about, separating the evil from this man. And he says, I can't remember exactly, but he says something about freeing him from evil. And then he forgives him completely. And the man is so shocked that he doesn't take any austere attitude, condemning him or anything like that. And that is what heals. I'm not saying it exactly the way, but if anybody, you got to watch the clip. It just is so moving the way he forgives him. And in fact, he adds the candlesticks, is it? For once, he gives them also to him. He went the twain, right? He goes the extra mile with him, gives that to him as well, but then frees him. Is a very touching, moving piece.
And the man knows that he must reform now, and that's the condition. Here he is. He has a big bag of silver, and the police catch him, and so the bishop says, "Oh, no, I gave him that silver, and why didn't you take the candlesticks too?"
As well.
And then he looks into his eyes. The bishop looks into the man's eyes with compassion, and he says, "I give you back to God."
Yes.
I have purchased your soul.
Yes.
And you have promised to be a new man.
I think that's needed in our prison system here. No wonder such recidivism continues, because I think it lacks that. Not to let error run rampant, but the love to separate the man as God's child from the behavior, that's missing. And I've, both in England as well as here, I see that that's what is missing. And many of the prisoners will say, they never really find who they are, and so they go out there and into the same thing again. And the prisons are filled all the time because of that, I feel.
Yes. Yeah, I saw someone recently on television who had been recently released from prison and is on this wonderful new path. And they're having more programs now where they are reviewing and releasing more prisoners, especially those who have reformed. Mm-hmm. And the only real reformation is to find yourself in Christ. And we thank God for that.
Yes.
And we, that's why we watch and pray, to know that this will come to pass. And at the same time, the wicked shall not go unpunished. It's a combination of both.
Yeah, I mean, any wickedness anywhere will not go unpunished. So sometime, someday, whatever deserves. And what is it? The wicked is not the master of the righteous. Also, right. That's what the Bible says. So.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that punishment of the wicked is divine love.
Yes.
It's like using the 4x4, right? Wake you up to what you. Yeah.
And the purpose of divine love is to
reform.
And someone told me recently, someone they knew who had to spend a few days in prison. They weren't protected. They did something they shouldn't have. They went to prison for a few days, and it scared the living out of them. And that reformed them. While if they'd been protected and oh no, we don't want this. No, sometimes it's it's school of hard knocks. Mm-hmm. And if you try to protect everyone from the school of hard knocks, you're creating a monster.
And it's often covering the error. I mean, you just.
And you harm a person. You don't allow them to learn the lesson that they need to learn.
That's the sympathy instead of the compassion.
Thank you.
Thank
And it's
you.
personalizing the error. Thank you. It's seeing the error as them. So you're protecting them. And it's also personalizes good. And that's why Mrs. Eddy in the first edition, she says personal sense over and over and over. It's a culprit. That's what we must cleanse ourselves of.
Something that occurred to me about saving a child all the time is it's like you're giving them a soft landing and they continually try to fall from a higher place, and eventually you're not going to be able to catch them. Something, it's just going to be bad.
No, you harm them.
When you're disciplined by what, Mrs. Eddy says?
Prison or scaffold.
The prison or the scaffold. And that's what will happen. Let's catch it early on with compassion.